This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 209 about travelling with grandchildren. Now, obviously, I do not have grandchildren yet. In fact, I'm a long way off, I hope. I've got a 10-year-old, so give me a couple of decades, I reckon. But I'm a long way off having my own grandchildren to travel with. But I got the idea for this episode from an interview I did with Rick Antonson, I think getting on to be a year ago now, and I've used other extracts from my chat with Rick some time back, but I've been really wanting to put together this episode because Rick's story of travelling with his grandson, Riley, just was such a lovely one, and I thought there must be more stories like that out there. And, of course, there were, so they are coming soon. But it got me thinking about my own grandparents, and I never had the opportunity to travel with them, although I did quite often go down I travelled myself, I suppose, to visit my grandmother who was living down in Albany by then. So it's about it was a 5 or 6 hour bus trip from Perth when I was my late teens, I suppose, was when I used to go and visit her the most. She's actually my grandmother who's responsible for the name of my blog, Not a Ballerina. So she was quite important. And my own son, of course, has travelled with his grandmother a few times, but with me there as well. So it's not quite the same as the stories in today's episode, but it is really nice to have that kind of intergenerational travel thing happening. My son won't remember that his grandmother came with us to Germany when he was 4 months old. I mean, he remembers from photos, but he doesn't remember anything about that trip, I guess. But he definitely remembers only a few years back where we all went to Tasmania for a couple of weeks together. And it is just nice to have, it's nice for me to have a grandmother there to do some of the looking after as well. But I think it's nice for everyone involved. But yeah, in today's episode, it's all about grandparents taking kids on trips without their parents around, except in one case where everybody's there. But let's start off with Rick's story because that's what really created this episode for me. And it is just a delightful story of Rick travelling with his grandson. So let's hear it.
So I went on a journey with Riley, 10 years old at the time, grandson. He's a remarkable individual, but not saying that as a grandfather. He's got the curiosity of a normal 10-year-old and the sort of implied sarcasm that comes with their looks, a willingness to go through a bit of tension with grandpa at the same time to just lean on your shoulder and fall asleep. So all of the attributes and nuances that one would want in a travel companion. And Riley and I spent some time in Banff in the Canadian Rockies, and it's a beautiful setting because the mountains grow right out of the village that is tucked there. And we palled around, saw some people that we knew, and got into this bit about here we are in the mountains and we're going to go through them, but our experience is going to go beyond that. And in fact, the book that I ended up writing is titled Train Beyond the Mountains. And it's as much an admonition as it is a definition. So we then boarded the Rocky Mountaineer, which is in the last 30 years become one of the world's most famous trains and certainly in the handful of most successfully operated and visually alerting train journeys in the world. So that's pretty neat. Riley and I traveled for 2 weeks, and during that time we went from Banff to Vancouver for a couple of days on the train, some time in Vancouver, back on the train for a few overnights in different communities like Whistler and Quesnel, Jasper, and then back for more time in the Canadian Rockies.
Amazing. Now, what did you learn travelling with a 10-year-old?
Well, I constantly learned that being 7 times his age does not give one any particular privileges, let alone it does not exempt you from that look on their face when they're trying to think what are you trying to tell me? There also, of course, was the adaptation that the one needs to acknowledge that, they do have this thing called a tablet as a constant companion, and it's there. And as much as you try to ease it out of the visual, oh no, it's there again in front of you. It is something that they enjoy doing in a similar way that I enjoy reading a morning newspaper. So there was a bit around that, because I'd look out the train outside and see all this magnificence of scenery that we were going through, and he might be watching a movie or playing a game, and I would nudge and things like that, which were awkward, but he had no reticence to let me know that he was having his Riley time and I should let him do so.
Yeah, I think that sounds very typical 10-year-old these days. But well done on learning to adapt. I think that's very impressive. And what did he learn from this epic trip with his grandfather?
I would think that as comes through in the manuscript about to become a book, as comes through in there, he was surprised by a lot of things. And this is a kid who's been to Europe with his parents and been to Mexico with his parents. He's been into the United States and around Canada. So he's not untraveled. Yet, I think because of the pace of train travel and the ongoing moment that is train travel, he would have time to absorb what he was seeing. And so you're in the middle of nowhere and you'll see a farmhouse that is no longer occupied, that at one point might have had a family and neighbors and everybody putting it up and saying, there is our new home and it's going to be ours for generations. And now it's falling apart. And the one-time bustling ranch, for whatever reason, is neglected. And he would ask about that. What happened, Grandpa? And he would also be interested in how did these railway tracks get made through this tunnel in the middle of the mountains. So things like that, which were learnings about the physical setup, but also about the emotional setup that was the settlement of Western Canada. And I was impressed that he would ask those questions and make some observations.
I think, I don't know, I want to say that well-travelled 10-year-olds or thereabouts often have that really in-depth curiosity and thinking beyond, what's really going on around them, because I think my son's very similar. But perhaps it's also just partly that whole, any child has, a greater degree of curiosity and they're allowed to not know stuff. Whereas a lot of adults, maybe we've conditioned ourselves to be less curious because we don't want to admit we don't know, how do they put the tracks through the tunnels? We should know that. So, whereas kids know they're allowed to ask any questions at all because that's what kids do.
Well said. I think that, another part of it is that while I mentioned, he would like a bit of his time with the electronics kit in front of him, he on the second day aboard the Rocky Mountaineer neglected that. He left it aside because there's an observation deck, maybe 3 meters by 3 meters at the back of each of the double-decker coaches. And he would be on there for hours at a time. The rest of the people would be out there, and sometimes he and I were alone. Other times there might be half a dozen or 10 other passengers. But he would easily nudge his way to get to the preferred position because people would let him pass. He'd get into the corner and he'd put his head just outside the railings, and the wind would blow, and he'd look at what was ever we were passing through. And he would, for hours at a time, stand there and absorb whatever the wind and scenery puts through the mind of a 10-year-old. And I wondered at that. And I asked him, and he said, I'm thinking about people. He said, I'm thinking about you. We went by a place where a school bus was waiting for our train to go by. He said, I waved to the kids. They waved back to me. I wondered about them. Isn't that fascinating?
That is awesome. I would love to think that my son would do that on a long-distance train trip, but I haven't tested him out yet. I love long-distance train travel. I can think of nothing better than watching the world go by for a week, just from a train carriage. But I have often wondered, when will my son be old enough that he will do that without kind of, complaining that it takes so long. So that's a really encouraging story. I really am very encouraged by that story of travel with a 10-year-old and thinking, maybe it is time to take my 10-year-old on a long train trip. Well, he'll be 11 before we get out of Western Australia and can take any kind of long train trip, but it's something to think about. Now, Rick mentioned a book that he has actually written about that experience. It's called Train Beyond the Mountains, Journeys on the Rocky Mountaineer. I think it's now due out next year. I think, like many books, there's been a COVID delay, but I'll make sure I mention that in the Thoughtful Travellers group when it does come out, because I am very keen to read it. I've read some of Rick's other books and they're brilliant. Now, my next guest today is Nan Caple, and she has done some stellar travelling with grandchildren, not just one or two of them either, in fact, but I will let Nan explain.
Well, look, we've been very blessed to have 4 children, and we've just in COVID time had 2 more additional grandchildren. So our total of grandchildren is 10.
Wow.
So that's a big number, and they range from 6 down. So they're all squashed together, which is so lovely. And we don't live very far apart from one another. So although in recent times we haven't had much of a chance to get together, they normally have had lots of opportunity to enjoy cousin time together. So we began, it would have been 5 years ago now, so we only had one grandchild then, but we do share a family holiday each year, competing in a triathlon at Noosa in November. So it's always the Melbourne Cup weekend, that first weekend, and we're able to enjoy a 5-day time together. And we've, as a family, have enjoyed at a very fun level, competing at different commitments to these competitions. It seems a nice thing to hang a holiday around.
Yeah, have fun.
And so some of us would do just one event, or some would do the whole 3, or some would do a tag team or something like that. So we've but getting there from Melbourne is actually, a bit of an exercise. So we began, it always begins at the airport when we're trying to actually gather together the equipment, and there's a lot of equipment that's needed. We have been taking bikes with us and things like this.
Gosh,
so
yes.
That's an exercise when you've also got prams and cots and the car seats that are needed at the other end. So we do talk about gathering the circus together at the airport and then moving on, and it is an absolute moving circus. But look, we've enjoyed staying at the same spot in different apartments. So there's the 5 apartments that we're able to all share together. And evolve as each of the little grandchildren has come along, and this spot, certainly the first 2 days are focused around getting the competition happening, and then the actual day of the competition is quite an exercise because it begins very early at the wee small hours, and you've little children out who've been awake for a long time with their parents pushing, and then certainly for my husband and myself as the grandparents, we get handed. It's a bit like handing the baton over, because I need to compete, and then I'll come back and hand it over because we needed to compete. Yeah. So it's an absolute logistical exercise, but certainly well worth it. And we had one of our daughters living overseas, and her family came home and shared one of these holidays with us a couple of years ago, and she organised through a simple Airtasker to get a photographer to come to take family photos. So we actually have these wonderful photos taken by a terrific photographer who managed to pull together some lovely shots in what was an absolute circus, as we were all trying to look in one direction.
I bet.
At that stage, we had 8 grandchildren all trying to look at us.
And all very little, yeah.
Yes, to get them to pay attention. So we've just had a lovely, lovely, very bonding family time there. There's been lots of tears, as there always are when children all get together, but lots of fun times too. So that's been a lovely probably highlight. And this year it seems like it won't go ahead, certainly from Victoria, but we've been assured that we can come back again next year. So we'll look forward to that.
Oh, that is something to look forward to. That sounds like just, I mean, I can imagine your grandkids as they grow up, just having the fondest memories of a full family holiday like that with the grandparents and everyone and the cousins. Oh, wonderful.
It is. It's just lovely. And, of course, they just enjoy going from one house to another and knowing someone in each little house that'll give them, something from the fruit bowl or the lolly jar.
Yes. If it was me, I'd be going everywhere and getting a lolly from each spot. Yeah. I'm super impressed with Nan and her family's approach to this, making sure that everyone gets a kind of a holiday and the whole family, all those grandkids get together. And I think that's just what a wonderful way to make sure that those family ties are strong, even if they're living all in different places. Now, my final guest today is a delightful listener from Alice Springs, right in the middle of Australia, named Fiona. And Fiona was a brave volunteer when I put in a request in the Thoughtful Travellers group saying, hey, I would just need to speak to one more person who's travelled with their grandkids. And it was such a delight to chat to Fiona, and she had a fabulous story to tell about a trip she and her husband took with 2 of their grandkids.
Well, I was trying to remember why we had said we would take them on a trip, and I think perhaps it was because we love travelling, and so we had always sent them postcards or brought them a little present. So they must have at some stage said, well, when can we come? And so we said, well, when you're double digits, we'll take the 2 oldest grandchildren who are cousins but don't live in the same town, that we would take them on a trip. And sure enough, the year when Grace was about to turn 10, she said, when are you taking us on a trip? And we thought, I suppose we did promise. And I think the children thought that we would take them to Bali or Hawaii. And we thought about it and we decided that that was more somewhere that their parents were likely to take them on a family holiday. And so we came up with the idea of going to Amsterdam because Grace had just read a book about Anne Frank, and we thought, well, we've never been to Amsterdam. And then we thought we'd go to Edinburgh because we love Edinburgh, and my mum was Scottish, and both children had met her, so they knew their great-grandmother. And then London, just because London.
It's nearby.
Yes. And then after we'd booked and planned it all, and this was only about a 2.5-week trip, the night before we went, I thought, what have we done? We don't know whether they will cope with the long flight. Maybe they'll argue because they've only really got together for little family holidays. What if they don't like the food? What if they're homesick? What if some accident happens and we're responsible? So I really only had one night of sheer panic and then we were off.
Yeah. That's the best thing, is just to get underway and then you can't panic anymore because you're doing it.
And they coped magnificently. Oh. They were great. And so we started off in Amsterdam, and everywhere we went, we booked walking tours because we thought that's a great way to get around. And our grandson, Xander, he is a little bit reluctant to walk. He was not someone that was keen on sort of hiking, whereas Grace, living near us, had been on a few small walks with us. So we told him that the best thing to do was to walk right up with the guide, because then you can hear them when they give a little talk, plus you have access to answering sort of questions and so on. And he just did it. And he was ahead of us with the guide everywhere we went. And then I guess the other thing we had to work out was about meals. And I think in Amsterdam we realised that now we had 4 people to sort out where we're going to eat. And we would suggest something and one of the grandkids would say, oh, but I don't like that. And so we just decided that we would go shopping because all the places we booked were self-contained units. And so we just went grocery shopping everywhere we went.
Clever.
And we let the children choose what they wanted for dinner, pick a salad, pick some fruit, whatever, and that worked out perfectly. It was much easier with the grandkids to take them out doing stuff all day and then come back to our place and cook dinner.
Yeah, and they could all choose what they want, each choose what they wanted. That sounds very smart. Wow. So they were both 10 or 10-ish?
Grace was 10, Xander was 11.
Right. Wow.
It was
cool.
a great age. It was a really good age, and they loved everything that we did. And we I was trying to remember why we picked some things but not others, and I couldn't really remember why. But we went in Amsterdam. We went to the Van Gogh Museum, and I went and asked and said, "Do you have any activities for children?" And they said, "Oh, yes, we do." And they gave us this sheet, and you had to, in every room, you had to go and find a particular painting, and it was all clues. And then at the end, there was a secret message, and you won a prize. It was one of those things where we had a better experience because we did it through the eyes of the children.
There's so many. Yeah, it's often like that, isn't it? Because I travel with my son who's now 10, so similar age. And some of the activities, especially that good museums can put on, are just incredible. And you really do get to experience more because, all of us like to, have a bit of a game with something or learn something in a different way. And, we're all kids at heart. So, yeah, what a great bonus.
It was like I just came out of that museum thinking that if we hadn't had the grandkids, we would have sort of wandered around, looked at a bit of this and a bit of that. But because they were very competitive as to who was going to finish first, we worked hard and we got those clues and we enjoyed it so much. And then we went on to Edinburgh and we did a walking tour and then decided to book another one. So we did a Harry Potter walking tour. And we probably wouldn't have done that if we didn't have the kids, but it was great. And then we said, well, we have to walk up Arthur's Seat because that's what you do when you're in Edinburgh. And as I say, my grandson was a bit, not sure about this. And as we climbed up, he was like, how much further? When are we going out for breakfast? So on. When we got to the top, he just jumped around and I said, just remember, sometimes in life when you think you're not going to enjoy something, it's actually worth it. And he was like, yeah. And we took a great selfie of the four of us on the top,
Oh, my gosh. Oh, these kids are so lucky. What a special experience for them to be travelling with grandparents.
I tried to think about, was there anything that I didn't like about it? And there was nothing. Apart from that one night of anxiety before we left.
Yeah.
We had a great time and they got on well and we soon developed a routine of sort of having breakfast, just cereal or toast, and then I always took extra food and a few sandwiches and some fruit in my bag, so if anyone was hungry and we weren't near a cafe, they could have something. We took water and I had a sort of little supply of lollipops, which were like the emergency stash, or if somebody got a bit tired and whined, I would say,
a quick bribe.
Yeah. And so we had a great time in Edinburgh. And the other thing that I loved about the children was we made sure they both had the same amount of spending money.
Ah, clever.
So we sort of topped up what their parents had given them. Yeah. And, they didn't spend a cent on anything for themselves until they had bought all presents for their family. So right from Amsterdam and into Edinburgh, it was all about something for mum, something for dad, something for their siblings. And then we went to London and we had a day at the Warner Brothers Harry Potter Studios.
Fun.
It was so much fun. And we had watched again so that we knew what we were heading into. It was wonderful. And that's when they first started spending any of their money on themselves. Oh. So, it was a humbling experience for us.
Yeah.
And being so caring.
I am so impressed, and I can just tell that Fiona's two grandkids had an amazing experience. I can only assume that the younger grandkids are also now asking for their trips, so that could get problematic. But also so many good tips in there too for grandparents who might be thinking, yeah, we want to take our grandkids travelling somewhere. So very, very cool. And thank you so much, Fiona, for volunteering as a listener to come on. I really, really appreciate it. Now, that is it for episode 209 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. So I hope you've enjoyed these interesting stories. I found them great, and I can't wait to be a grandparent someday. I feel like there's just a different dimension to taking your grandkids travelling as to travelling with my own son, even though I adore doing that too. Huge thank you to all my guests today. First up, I chatted with Rick Antonson, and you can find out all about Rick's books at rickantonson.com. Thank you also to the lovely Nan Caple. Nan, you might remember, has some holiday accommodation on Kangaroo Island down here in Australia, and you can find out info on that at snellingsview.com.au. And another big shout out to Fiona, our listener. Thank you. And if you want to be where people like Fiona are, come along to our Facebook group for Thoughtful Travellers. Just search for Thoughtful Travellers in Facebook, or see the link in the show notes. For this episode, the show notes are at notaballerina.com/209. As always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.